Welcome to Amp Up, the show where we take a website that needs a little help and we amp it up. In our last episode, I was working with a developer named Jessica on a site called Coming Out Space. This site is an open source library of coming out stories for the LGBTQ community and for anyone else who wants to learn. They're about to publish the coming out story of famed YouTuber Gigi Gorgeous, and they want their site spiffed up for the occasion.
Coming Out Space is a WordPress site. We've used the official AMP WordPress plugin to convert the story pages to native AMP. All AMP, all the time.
We worked on this for a little bit. Okay, actually, Jessica did most of the work. But the point is, we've got everything working now.
Except the fancy menu generated by the TapTap plugin.
Right, and if Nate, the founder and owner of ComingOut.space, finds out his site has no menu, he'll be really upset.
What the f?
So we could simply replace the TapTap menu with an AMP sidebar component from AMP, but it seems more fun to try to keep the current fancy functionality.
That said, it would be great to simplify it. The TapTap menu needs to cover a wide range of use cases, so currently it comes with about 26K of CSS, plus some font awesome, plus another font, plus also like a whole bunch of inline CSS.
Here's some good news though. The TapTap JavaScript is simple. One file here, taptapaccordion.js, is just used for submenus. We don't have a submenu here. And here's the other file, taptap.js. Unminifying it in DevTools, we see that it simply uses jQuery to add and remove classes.
Yeah, looking at the CSS, it reveals the rest of the puzzle. The classes, which end in -active, make the menu show up with nice animations.
Well, in that case, we could rebuild the animations using the AMP animation component, but let's see if we can do this the easy way instead. I want to try simply replacing the jQuery that changes classes with AMP bind.
Won't that still leave you with a lot of CSS though?
Yeah, it will. We'll try to kind of reduce that too, I promise, as we go. So what is AMP bind? AMP bind lets you change what's shown on your site in response to user actions by binding an HTML attribute to a state variable. The three steps are state, bind, mutate. First, you use AMP state to assign JSON to a state variable. In this example, we define a state variable named foo with the property bar. Next, you bind the JavaScript expression to an HTML elements attribute. This will be a special attribute in brackets, some of which, like text, are added by AMP. Naturally, this expression can include your state variable, so this expression sets the text in this paragraph to the value in foo.bar. And finally, use the on attribute to set up an AMP action to mutate that state variable. In this example, tapping this button changes the text that's displayed. If the state variable contains a single value, the first step is optional. AMP bind doesn't execute on page load, so we don't need an initial value. Just bind and mutate. It's simple. State, bind, mutate. State, bind, mutate.
State, bind, mutate. State, bind, mutate. State, bind, mutate. State, bind, mutate. State, bind, mutate.
Jessica, snap out of it!
Thanks, I needed that.
Let's use AMP bind for our menu. We add an extra class to each div when the menu button is tapped. When it's tapped again, we remove it. The CSS classes that make the menu active are generally just the existing CSS class plus that -active suffix. So I'm going to make a state variable here that either will contain an empty string or just -active. For example, when the menu button is pressed, the div with class taptap background color will gain the class taptap background color active. When the button is pressed again, that class will go away. Let's call the state variable taptap class suffix. Since it will contain a single value, we don't need to declare it with AMP state. We'll go right to the mutate state. And here's the code. This on attribute assigns an event handler to the tap event. The handler is AMP set state, which we send a JavaScript expression that toggles the value of taptap class suffix between an empty string and -active. Then we bind the class attribute of each div to another JavaScript expression. When the page loads, this div has the class taptap background color. When the button is pressed, our extra class will get added or removed. So I've just done this for each of the divs. Let's try it out. And the classes are changing beautifully, but the menu still isn't showing up. Here's the deal. The AMP plugin does tree shaking to determine which CSS isn't being used on a page. That's how it reduces the CSS. The active classes are added by JavaScript and don't appear in the HTML. So the AMP plugin just figured they weren't necessary. So I'll have to add the CSS back in. While I'm doing that, Nate, can you tell us again about how you started Coming Out Space?
Coming Out, that space started as sort of a blog when I was living in Toronto at the time I met Jess. And originally, it was just a collection of stories. But when I moved to New York, I got more serious about making it a nonprofit. It's a 501c3 organization. And we've done a bunch of work to rebuild the site and make it more robust since then.
Are you excited to have Gigi Gorgeous' story on the site?
Yes, we're super excited to have Gigi Gorgeous on the site. We're lucky to have had the chance to have a lot of LGBTQ influencers we've worked with on the site before, and she's definitely one of our favorites.
So the CSS is restored, but we've got one more problem. AMP is applying a gigantic negative inline style top to these elements, so they aren't showing on the screen. Once in a while, AMP does get thrown off by unusual CSS. These divs are all position fixed, and they're set with a top of negative 1000%. When AMP sees a position fixed element, it gives it a slight top offset to make sure it looks right when seen in an AMP viewer. And when it sees a negative 1000%, it's just confused by that. This is an edge case, but I'm going to file an issue on GitHub for the AMP team. In the meantime, I'm just going to change position fixed to position absolute. And it works. Woohoo! Sweet, sweet victory. It works.
Not to interrupt or anything, but while you were doing that, I rebuilt the entire nav and animation with the original TapTap CSS.
You did what?
It works on my test page, and it's got a lot less CSS than yours. Going through the TapTap plugin CSS files and the JS files, I realized that our site used little of it, and that it would likely be cleaner and easier to just rebuild the navigation from scratch using the minimum CSS required. Once that's done, we won't even need the TapTap plugin at all on any part of the website. On the AMP page, we can use AMP bind just like you did in your example, Ben. And on the non-AMP pages, I can use JS to trigger the same classes we're changing with AMP bind. The CSS can load for the nav across the entire website, and instead of 26K, it's just 4K.
Wow.
Massive improvement. As Ben was saying, the animations that toggle the button between the hamburger and the closing X, as well as the slide down and background color transitions, are all CSS. Our AMP bind just toggles classes on the divs. Now let's stick this on the actual site. To give myself a blank slate, I'm going to go ahead and uninstall and delete TapTap. What a huge weight off our shoulders. The TapTap plugin was injecting HTML into the footer of the website to make the navigation. That seems pretty unnecessary and messy to me, so I'm glad we're getting rid of it on the entire site. Instead, we're going to work with a regular WordPress nav in the header.php file, and we'll make some very small changes to implement the mockup. You will notice in the WordPress header.php file markup that I'm not able to directly change the UL for the menu or its list items. These are all registered in WordPress using the WP_nav menu settings. I could create a custom menu walker to build in the AMP bind attributes into the UL, but instead I'm going to keep things super simple and use the nav element that wraps the UL that WordPress spits out. Here I'll set up my AMP bind state and attributes. I'm also going to replicate the TapTap hamburger button on our own navigation. So now that I have the hamburger, I'm going to add all of the CSS for it, as well as the nav, into a new amp-styles.css file, which I can enqueue in our functions.php file so that the whole website can take the new nav styles, not just our AMP page. Now the AMP nav is working great, but since TapTap is gone from the entire site, the nav will not work on our non-AMP pages. So I'm going to need to add some JavaScript to replicate the AMP bind behavior on the rest of the pages. And we're done.
Okay, well, I'll pitch in here. The old site used some JavaScript to make the nav sticky. While this JavaScript method works, it's also simple to do with CSS instead. We make the nav position fixed, set its width to 100%, set the background to white, and put some padding top on the rest of the site. Done. Now when you scroll the site, the nav stays where it is.
I think it's super powerful that with AMP bind we can keep the existing fancy functionality of the navigation, but given another opportunity to redo the whole website with AMP, I think I'd give AMP sidebar a try. So that's it. Now the coming out space story pages are all in AMP, and you'll notice that they look and feel the same, but they just load way faster because they've got much less CSS and JS.
And don't forget that AMP will automatically lazy load images and videos that are outside of the viewport. This is a big help for large video libraries.
Nate, what do you think?
Okay, so we're on the home page. Let's click on one of the pages with a video. Wow, quick. I'm just on LTE. I actually don't have great service in the building, so it's super quick. This is amazing. Smooth, looks the same. It's great.
Try a sharing button.
LinkedIn. Oh my God, immediately. It's great.
We'll call this a success.
I think so.
This is so great. Thanks, guys.
Do you think we should turn the whole site to AMP?
Yeah, I think we should do it.
So I'm glad this worked out so well, and I'm glad coming out space is now faster and easier for users and also for the developers. Tune in next time as we find a site and amp it up. To learn more about AMP, just subscribe to the AMP channel. And see you next time on AMP Up.